Knight f3, King's Indian attack, opening line. With the King's Indian opening, White retains the option of various second pawn moves. However, Black is allowed to develop at leisure. d5, King's Indian attack, opening line. Black responds to 1 Knight f3 with a natural pawn move, which White can transpose into a number of openings. Here, a King's Indian with colors reversed, or the King's Indian attack. g3, King's Indian attack, Barkza opening line. This is the characteristic move of either the Reti, the Catalan, or the King's Indian attack. The latter is defined fully by 6e4 instead of, for example, c4. Bishop g4, King's Indian attack, Barkza opening line. b3, out of opening book. Bishop g2 would have been in the King's Indian attack, Barkza book opening. Knight d7. Bishop b2, Nimzovich-Larsen attack, classical variation, transposed, opening line. e6, out of opening book. Bishop takes f3 would have been in the Nimzovich-Larsen attack, classical variation, book opening. Bishop g2 enables the short castle. Knight g f6 frees Black's pawn at g7 from the pin. Castle kingside. c6, King's Indian attack, Yugoslav variation, transposed, opening line. d3, King's Indian attack, Yugoslav variation, opening line. Bishop d6, out of opening book. a5 would have been in the King's Indian attack, Yugoslav variation, book opening. Clears the way for a kingside castle. Knight b d2, King's Indian attack, Yugoslav variation, transposed, opening line. Castle kingside, King's Indian attack, Yugoslav variation, opening line. h3, out of opening book. Rook e1 would have been in the King's Indian attack, Yugoslav variation, book opening. Attacks Black's bishop at g4. Bishop h5 moves it to safety. a3, h6, Queen e1, Queen a5, e3, Bishop c7, Knight h4, g5 threatens White's knight at h4. Knight h f3 moves it out of harm's way. e5, e4, Rook f e8, Knight h2, Queen b6 pins White's pawn at f2. Queen c1, a5, Rook e1, Bishop d6, Knight d f1, d takes e4, d takes e4. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Bishop c5, Knight e3 frees White's pawn at f2 from the pin. Rook a d8, Knight h f1. g4. H takes g4, threatens black's bishop at h5 and isolates black's pawn at h6. Knight takes g4, protects black's bishop at h5 and blocks white's pawn at g3. f3, threatens black's knight at g4. Knight takes e3. Knight takes e3. Takes the knight away from the edge of the board. White wins a knight and a pawn for a knight and a pawn. Material is even. Bishop e7. King h1. Frees white's knight from the pin. Bishop g5. Pins white's knight. Rook e2. a4. b4. f5. E takes f5. Creates a passed pawn on f5 and isolates black's pawn at e5. White wins a pawn. White is ahead by a pawn in material. e4. f4. Frees the pin on white's knight, threatens black's bishop at g5 and creates a passed pawn on f4. Bishop takes e2. F takes g5. Threatens black's pawn at h6 and pushes the passed pawn. Black wins the exchange. Rook for bishop. Knight e5. g6. Moves it out of immediate jeopardy and creates a passed pawn on g6. Bishop f3. Partially pins white's bishop at g2 and removes the threat on black's pawn at e4. Bishop c3. Queen b5. Blocks white's pawn at b4. Queen f1. Queen takes f1. Check. Checks white's king. Rook takes f1. Removes the threat on white's king and moves it behind the passed pawn at f5. White wins a queen for a queen. h5. King g1. Releases the pin on white's bishop at g2. King f8. Bishop h3. b5. King f2. King g7. Blocks white's pawn at g6. g4. King h6. Slightly better is h4. Rook g1. Places it behind the passed pawn at g6. H takes g4. Threatens white's bishop at h3 and creates a passed pawn on g4. Bishop takes g4. Bishop takes g4. Knight takes g4. Check. Checks black's king. Knight takes g4. Check. Removes the threat on black's king and counterchecks white's king. Rook takes g4. removes the threat on White's king. White wins a bishop, a knight, and a pawn for a bishop, a knight, and a pawn. Rook d5 threatens White's pawn at f5. f6 moves it to safety and pushes the passed pawn. Rook d1 leads to g7. Rook d5, king e2, rook d7, g8, queen, rook takes g8, rook takes g8, rook c7, king e3, c5, bishop e5, king h7, bishop takes c7, king takes g8, b takes c5. Better is rook g8 leading to g7, rook f5, check, king e2, king h5, rook takes e4, king g6, rook e6, c5, b takes c5, rook takes c5, king d3, rook d8, check, bishop d4, which gains 2 rooks and loses a rook and a pawn by comparison. This was Black's only significant error of the game, but it was costly. Black was never able to regain the lost ground, and eventually resigned. g7 adds a promote threat at g7. Black resigns.